I think we should all be very afraid of what might come of next month's so-called economic reform roundtable. This will happen in Canberra. Nice, optimistic title, but with the federal budget headed toward decades of mounting debt, the Treasurer, as we now know from an inadvertent bungle by some public servant who didn't redact enough from an ABC Freedom of Information request, has been told, look, you've got to rein in spending and you will also have to increase taxes. Now, talking with ex-Treasury official David Pearl on the Sharry Show this week, he made the point to me that when we get these get-togethers, roundtables between politicians and bosses and trade unionists, the politicians think Jim Chalmers this time around, and in the past, treasurers like Paul Keating have already made up their minds on what they're going to do. So they've been briefed by Treasury and, you know, it's just going to be a talk fest and then what will happen has already been decided. Now, a report in the Financial Review today reminded me of the great assets test for the pension, including your house battle of the mid-1980s. It was around 1984. Keating was the Prime Minister, decided probably off the back, he was Treasurer, probably off the back of a similar, you know, for show get-together, that he was going to introduce an assets test for people applying for the age pension. Now, the problem with this is that the assets test was going to include your family home. Now, the clear message out of Canberra at that time was that, well, there's too many people well off, Australians were getting the pension, and this had to stop. Now, I was working in newspapers at the time at a relatively senior level, and we decided this assets test, which was originally going to include the family home, it was simply going too far. We found example after example of elderly Australians who could be called asset rich but cash poor. In other words, a single pensioner eligible, a woman largely, living in a large house, which back in those days could have been worth, say, $800,000, but with no chance of working again, her working life was over, and unwilling to sell or downsize the house, well, she was going to lose her pension. Now, if these changes had gone ahead, Keating tried to defend the change, but it became obvious, even to him, that this was unfair. Now, as one pensioner put it at the time, you can't eat your house. Now, I raise this because of a story in today's Financial Review that I mentioned. It caused me to have a clear case of déjà vu, or here we go again. The Fin Review reveals that the Department of Social Services has advised their new minister, Tanya Plibersek, that she and the government should look at reforming the pension assets test. And I thought, yep, here we go again. These faceless public servants want the minister of the generosity, warn the minister of the generosity of pensions, talk about pensioners having significant assets in addition to their homes, and that this needs to be reformed. Now imagine that, a taxpayer-funded public servant living in permanent employment in Canberra suggesting that a pensioner with a nice car, some good furniture and a big house shouldn't be getting the age pension after a life of paying taxes. Well, I think it stinks. And it hints that the family home might be back on the agenda for that meeting that we're seeing next month. Now, to her credit, Plibersek immediately ruled out the family home because she must have a longer memory than the uni graduate at Social Services. The same Financial Review article, though, quotes a bloke from the Grattan Institute, a bloke called Brendan Coates, who says retirees can live in Potts Point or they can live in Toorak. Strange comparison, just quietly, with a $5 million house and receive the same pension that a person living in a $500,000 unit in Bendigo or Bathurst. Yep, so what? They're all still captured by the current assets test that makes you add up your non-housing assets to work out if you get the pension or not. Why does it matter where you live? And as our example from all those years ago pointed out, you can't eat your house. Now, Coates says, quote, this system needs to change. Now, backing Keating's idea of including the family home in the assets test. Now, Tanya's a smart politician. She won't fall for that, I hope. But as they say, where there's smoke, there is some fire. Coates, though, went further. As it stands, the first $250,000 of a home's value does count toward the assets test. But after that, the house value doesn't matter. Now, this Grattan Institute commentator says we should include the value of any property above $750,000 in the assets test, and he claims that would save $4 billion a year in pensions across the country not paid and grow over time. As I said, here we go again. He further claims this would encourage people, this is the nub of it, to downsize, to sell. Let's just hope Jim Chalmers doesn't read the Financial Review and, as I said, be very afraid of what might come from that round table next month.